So I'm Connie McFarland. I'm a member of the Education Committee, which is a great committee. I'm going to put a little pitch in for that. We always need ideas, and we always need more people to come and help us figure out what we're going to talk about on a Sunday morning. It is my pleasure today to introduce John Erling, who's trying to make a dash out the back door, but Margaret won't let him. So when I moved to Tulsa in 1978, I was pretty sure that you could ski the Tulsa mountains. And I was talking to John about that. I still think it's a Santa Claus myth. I think there's a place up there we could come skiing. But for those of you who listen to KRMG, where John was a noted personality for 30 years, he was talking to people, interviewing people, and he took that skill after leaving the station into this wonderful podcast called The Voices of Oklahoma. So if you haven't, look it up, listen to it, tons of topics. Today he's going to speak about religious leaders in Oklahoma. So John, if you want to come up here, you can speak from back there, but don't leave the room.
Thank you.
He's been joking about leaving.
I want to be careful not to walk down the tar zone there because I don't want to get... As I walk past this picture here, I see Chester Cadjo, and I interviewed Chester. As we know, he had Alzheimer's, and about 5-6 months before he succumbed to that. But we have his great story telling how Quick Trip started, along with Bird Homes. Tom Clark attended this church for many, many years, and I have his interview as well. So I've had some history there, and I think I'll get over here so that we don't have any feedback. And I thank you for this opportunity to speak about a special project that I have been doing now for 14 years. My mission here today is twofold: to introduce you to a website known as voicesofoklahoma.com. And then we do have a podcast as well that shares the story. And the second mission I'm here for is to introduce you to record your oral history. Every one of you has a great story to tell. And those of us of a certain age need to be telling these stories now for the generations to come. Many of you have grandchildren that will want to hear your voice, well, maybe 50 years from now, because I'm going to count on you living 50 years. Living a long time, they're going to want to hear your voice. In time, they will forget the sound of your voice. Your voice will be gone unless you record it. And you can do this with these great phones. I'm going to be using this phone as I play back today. These are so wonderful. There's an app, record memo app, and you can do that. I've done that with my own family. And you just set it down, and then you sit and talk. So if I get one or two out of this class, convert you into becoming a historian, vocally, oral, then that would be my mission. So that's what we've got going here today. I'm now in my 14th year of recording Voices of Oklahoma. I was 30 years on KRMG, 3 years with an advertising agency, and this idea came to me. 260 voices and stories I have recorded. And 95 of those are no longer with us, those storytellers, prompting philanthropist George Kaiser to say, "There's no way I'm ever going to be interviewed by you, John." I would love to get his story, but he will not do it. The most dramatic death after I interviewed someone was Supreme Court Justice Marion Opala. He was 89 years old. He was looking forward to his 90th birthday, and 4 days later, he died. And that interview is so precious because he was in Poland when the Nazis invaded in 1939. He was there, and he walked out of Poland. He was used by the British because he could understand several languages, and he's got a great accent. Marion Opala. When you go to our website, it says search, you put in his name, and you'll listen to a great, great story. We are now in partnership with the Oklahoma History Center, and when we all pass on, including myself, they're there to take it over and to continue the work that I've done. And so I really appreciate Trait Thompson, who's the director now of Oklahoma History Center. We published a book 2 years ago, and we're in the midst now of publishing another book, which should hopefully come out before Christmas, and the proceeds of that go to voicesofoklahoma.com. I'm largely supported by foundations, great foundations in our town that have, and the Kaiser Foundation is one of them. I should have them all here. I will give you that. But Voices of Oklahoma has become a resource tool for authors of several books. Bloomberg News Agency reached out to me the other day. They wanted something. British Broadcasting Corporation used our material. The Boy Scouts of America have reached out, and including the New York Times, having given us credit for an interview that we did on voicesofoklahoma.com. I have found myself in many interesting situations. Here's one that's interesting. I've actually introduced relatives to each other. They didn't even know each other. I had a request from one person who said, I'd like a copy of an interview you did with so-and-so. And I said, I'd be happy to oblige. I'll give you that. Well, then I got another request from a lady in Bartlesville for the same interview. And I said, well, that's bizarre that these two people would do that. And then one name, and I mentioned the name to this other fellow who lives in Midtown. He says, I don't know that person. Somehow I kept working, and it turned out they were cousins, and they didn't even know each other. I have about 20 topics that we've covered. I didn't start out saying, I've got to do this topic, that topic, that topic. I just went for a smattering of interviews. As they came to me mentally, as people told them to us, suggested them to us, that's the way I did it. Well, it turned out it came out to some very significant topics, like law and order, law enforcement, the media, music, Native Americans, sports, social work, philanthropy, military, business, and of course, one of our categories is religion. But let's talk about the Bible, because certainly that is oral history. Some of it is. They didn't call it oral history, and I'm consulting Bible scholars now, so when I talk, remember, I'm getting this from scholars, okay? It's not coming from me. Bible scholars call it Bible tradition, and certainly that was used in the Bible. But we have to remember that the omnipotent God would be able to inspire writers to write, even if they weren't doing it with the oral tradition, that God spoke directly to prophets. And so it's reasonable for us to probably question, and when we see a quote in the Bible, to say, well, how did anybody know that that quote was actually made? Well, we could question events such as when an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, telling him, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. Okay, how do we know about that quote? Did Matthew interview Joseph? Perhaps Joseph told Jesus the whole story and Jesus shared it with the disciples. So all of these people were talking, and they had their memories to work with, and you had to know which memory you could trust. Luke, when he wrote his book, he did it all on interviews. He interviewed witnesses. But his story, based on witnesses, is collaborated by Matthew, Mark, and John, that everything Luke wrote on, interviewing people, was corroborated in those other Gospels. So those witnesses that he had were pretty accurate. Now, the scholars say, well, he didn't use them all, and he certainly had to throw out some of them. And so it was word of mouth. Even oral history has not been trusted. In World War II, FDR, President Roosevelt, he instructed oral historians to go into the field in Germany and wherever they were to interview soldiers. And that's when oral history began to have some legitimacy. But because before that, it was, well, can you trust that? Can you trust that? Because one story can be told. Listen, amongst you couples, spouses, I can just hear it. He will start telling a story, and then she'll say, oh no, it didn't happen that way. Well, there you have it right there. See, we have two different versions of a story, so you have to be careful. Even the people that I interview may not be reflecting and telling the story, even what happened to them, the way it is, but we go with their story, because I have found some discrepancies, and I've left it alone because that was their memory and the way they saw the event. So we wonder then, how were the prophets inspired? 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 20-21, we read, above all, you must understand that no prophecy of Scripture came about by the prophet's own interpretation of things. For prophecy never had its origin in the human will, but prophets through humans spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. And so when there's that gap of we don't know how that quote came about, we have to believe in the inspiration of the Bible by God. We rely on memories. I've been a real fan of the Apostle Paul. And a year ago, I bought a book on him, and then we had the opportunity to cruise the Greek islands. And I know there are people here in this audience who were there. I think you guys were 2 days ahead of us. It's funny when you're in Athens and you're walking down the hotel lobby. Tom Maxwell, what are you doing in Athens? And that was fun. You guys were 2 days ahead of us. And so we went to ancient Corinth. You were there. And we saw exactly what Paul saw when he was there. The mountains, I mean, a lot of ruins, of course. But we saw the geography of the land, and it was just such a thrill to see that. And then we saw a platform or a podium. It was made out of sandstone, where he was tried for his faith. Our guide said he either stood above or down, and we saw that, and I have a picture of that, to actually witness where Paul was. And then we went on to Ephesus in Turkey, and Paul was there as well, along with John, who was to take care of the mother of Jesus. And they lived there for 9 years in Ephesus. And for us to stand in front of a stadium, they built them in half stadiums. They didn't do in the round, and you could see what a stadium had been. And we were told how Paul stood there and was going to be arrested. And he said, you cannot arrest me because my father was a Roman officer, and I can only be arrested in Rome. And on top of that, I'm Greek and I'm a Jew, and you cannot arrest me. So the soldiers took him away, and they pointed up to a mountain, and they put him up in a prison up in a mountain for his safety, not for what he had said. But the soldiers thought he needed to be, well, you know, really, that mountain, whatever. And some of this we have to, but the archaeologists have defined what I was talking about, that podium, that stadium where Paul was. It was a thrill to be able to see that. Luther's small catechism. I grew up in an evangelical Lutheran church called Church of the Lutheran Brethren, largely started up in the Midwest, North Dakota, Minnesota, South Dakota. They've expanded across the country by now. But I had, for confirmation, you had to memorize the words of Luther's small catechism, which Luther wrote in the 1500s. He wrote it for children. And the only question and answer that and then we had to stand in front of the church and answer those questions, of course. And the only question I can remember, the answer is, who wrote the Bible? Holy men of God wrote as they were inspired by the word of God, by God. I remember that. Rex Calvert was a World War II veteran. Rex made 3 landings, Normandy, Margaret and I have been there to Normandy. We saw Omaha Beach, Utah Beach, and he made 3 landings, and he was going to make a landing at Normandy. And the chaplain came up and spoke to them, and he said, we're going to pray for your safety. This is going to be dangerous, but I'm going to pray for all of your lives, that they can be spared. Well, they felt good about that. Then they went down the lower hatch of the boat, and they were all putting on their uniforms and all their gear and their weapons. And then they saw the chaplain was putting on his weapon. And they said to him, but I thought you prayed for our safety. And he said, prayer is good, but this is faster. I didn't try to create a category of religion, but I knew some people in the community, of course, that I've known down through the years, and Oral Roberts was one of them. So, Oral Roberts and I had a contentious relationship, as some of you may know, because on the air I would make fun of his fundraising, and he built the City of Faith, and I built the Kennel of Care, and mine was for cats and dogs who would come in from around the world, and mine with praying paws and all that kind of thing. But I was quick to point out that I never made fun of his faith, because at the heart of it all, it was all the same, the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we knew that. He did not become as welcomed to society as Billy Graham did because of his faith healing. And so Billy Graham would ask Oral to come to some of his crusades and pray, and Oral would say, oh, no, I don't want to taint your ministry. I have controversy around me and you don't. But I think ultimately he did it one time. As everything does work, I am trying to get this to connect, and of course it won't when you want to use it. And I'm just going to have to probably play this off the speaker of my phone to make this work and walk up and down the aisle here so that you can hear it. So I have Oral here. He is talking about how he became known to the nation. And you know what? I could probably put it up here too. Thank you. Right. And so he's telling us how he became known. Well, this is not working. And that's too bad.
Should work now.
Dave, are you an electrician? This man pushed a switch and we got electricity.
It's her fault.
Thank you. Thank you. And you have saved the day here.
It was a great time. I stayed there 9 weeks.
Okay, hopefully I can bring this back to the beginning.
Your first service in Tulsa would have been in a tent.
Yes, Steve Pringle
Can you hear that?
was the pastor, and he had a 1,000-seat tent up. And when I got there, he had heard that I had had a visitation from the Lord. And he asked me, would I come and preach a couple of nights for him, Tuesday and Wednesday. And I was glad to do that because I didn't know very many people in Tulsa. And I went, and at the end of 2 nights, his crowds had doubled, and he asked me would I stay till Sunday. Well, by Sunday, all the seats were filled and people were standing. And it was a great time. I stayed there 9 weeks. And during the crusade, a man stepped across the street, pulled out his gun, and shot at me. And the hole was 18 inches from my head. And we asked him, well, the police asked him why he did that. He said he didn't know. He didn't know me, he didn't have anything against me. He just felt like he should do it. And we forgave him and went on our way.
You were involved in your healing ministry at that time. You were healing people, weren't you?
Yes, I was about 4 or 5 weeks into it.
So wasn't it at that time that the national media picked up on your story?
Yes, they picked up the story big time and carried the headlines that the evangelist is shot at. And it must have been a downtime in the media that day because the papers of America picked it up. And in one day I was known from coast to coast.
And then your life changed again, because I'm quite certain there were a lot of questions, people calling, other evangelists wanting to be in touch with you.
Yes, they phoned in and they flew in and they came by car and they came from the north, from Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, all those states, and people from Oklahoma. Then asked me after I left Tulsa crusade to come to their churches. And that's how I launched my ministry.
You conducted a one-night service in Nowata, Oklahoma, which turned out to be one of the most important nights of your life in the life of a little deaf boy.
That's right. The little boy, when his ears popped open, he looked up at his mother. He's about 10 or 12, something like that. And he was scared. He'd never heard before. She broke into tears, hugged him and kissed him. Then I talked to him. I got behind him where he couldn't see my lips. And I talked to him, and I became convinced that we had a miracle. And it was a great time in my life.
Is this the time then when you talked about the feeling that you got in your right hand?
That came around the same time. I kept feeling something tickling or vibrating in my right hand. I didn't know what it was. And so I ignored it. And I was heavy in seeking after God because I didn't want to be like other preachers. I wanted to plan my own path. And I went on a heavy fast and prayer time to ask God what this was in my hand. And he told me that it was his presence, and that from that hour you will heal the sick, and you will feel my presence in your right hand. Said it will come down to your elbow and your right arm into your right hand and no other place in your body. And I thought that was kind of strange, but it was true. The power came in my right hand at different times. It didn't come all the time. The first time that I really knew for sure was the Nowata experience. I touched the little boy, and then I went to a faith temple for a few services in Tulsa, and there was a couple of girls, Edith and Irma, and Irma had tuberculosis. She had been to Tallahassee and had come home, but she wasn't healed. So she came to Evelyn and me. We had known them for several years. I reached over and touched her in the name of Christ, and she's the first person who noticed my hand. She said, "Oral, what is that in your hand?" I said, "It's nothing, Irma. It's nothing." Because I didn't understand it myself. She said, "There's got to be something in your hand." I said, "Why do you say that?" She said, "The current flowed through my body like fire when you touched me with your right hand." And so I knew then that it was open to the public. I mean, the public heard about it.
Yeah.
So that's Oral's experience with that. We should point out that his mother was a faith healer as well. So that definitely was in his mind as he was a young man growing up. I went to California to interview him in Newport Beach. He lived in a condo. And there was always this story about how much money he had. It was a condo that had probably been purchased in the 80s. It was on a golf course. but it was in tattered furniture and all, and it was not as if he was living in the lap of luxury near his end at all. He was sitting in a big chair, and he had a big blanket on him because he was in ill health. So all of this time I'm thinking, does he know what I did on the radio? Does he really know? And then he talked about the media. He says, you know, because of my faith healing and everything else, he says, the media came after me. But I didn't push back, did I, John? I remember sitting there, and my appreciation and respect for him went through the roof, because I thought, well, I also know that he didn't have time to be listening to KRMG, but certainly his people told him about it, went through the roof, because he knew that this was important to preserve oral history for now and forevermore. So this man could have been anything. He could have been a politician. I've respected him more over the years. He could have been everything. He was so talented. He was 91 when he died, December 15th, 2009. I recorded it August 11th, 5 months before his death. He says he was quite a bit Indian. He said he was Cherokee, but I was reading where he was also Choctaw. He's the only person that I've asked, where was your mother born? And he said, I don't know. I think it was on the banks of a river somewhere, that this man came out of that. So there's total respect for him. Don't always have to agree with everything he said, but he probably was used to heal people. Francis Rooney, fourth generation of his family to own Manhattan Construction. He was the United States ambassador to the Holy See, served from 2005 to 2008. Now, if you've ever met Francis Rooney, you know that Francis has no problem meeting people. Very, very outgoing, very outgoing. In fact, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Florida, 2017 to 2021. His home is in Naples. In fact, he invited Margaret and I to visit him and Kathleen, and we did visit his home, and I hope that his home wasn't destroyed in all of this, because Naples was hit as well. But in this interview, he talks about how he was when he met Pope Benedict. Okay, now, here's Francis, who could talk to anybody, anywhere. He was a good friend of President George W. Bush, did work for him in Texas. They built things in our nation's capital. And so he talks then about meeting Pope Benedict.
Talk to us about that first visit. You walk into what room, and how does that work?
The way it works in the Vatican is it's a labyrinth. You go through one room, go through another big room where there's a big white marble chair. It's where the popes used to actually sit when they received dignitaries. I joked with the president when we were walking through there. I said, you know, up until about 30 years ago, the pope would have been sitting on that when he's talking with you. But anyway, not anymore. And you go around the corner through a couple more rooms. You get to the end, and you're just outside the papal library, which is the one they always use. It's got the big books on the end, the bookcases. That's the papal library. Just outside of it, there's an El Greco painting, and a lot of that kind of stuff there. So we get down to that. They open the door, we go in, we do photos with the Pope. Actually, we do the photos in an anteroom called the Ambassador's Receiving Room. We do all the pictures. My mother and aunt from Florida were there. Aunt Eileen was going to come, Aunt Eileen Ugly, but her doctor wouldn't let her travel. She was in failing health at the time. In fact, that's a different story about that. I think I put it in the book about asking my aunts to come. But anyway, they took all the pictures. Then Kathleen, the kids, Mom, all left. They shut this huge door. It's just me and a Pope sitting around a table just like this in his library. And I thought, this is really something. And I was nervous. I couldn't even really talk at first. And so he started talking. So then I finally got my deal going, because I had some things I was supposed to say.
So he put you at ease.
He did.
He could read immediately that you were...
In fact, I said, I imagine this happens all the time, doesn't it? He said, yeah, it does happen a lot. He's kind of a sense of humor, you know.
What is it about that moment? You're never at a loss for words, but you were then. What brings that on?
You're sitting there, and the Apostolic Palace is built, started in the 12th century and finished in the 14th or 15th. You've gone through all these cotton-picking rooms, which I think there's a strategy. It's kind of like the warm-up bouts. You get in there, and they shut the door, and you're in the Pope's library. Every pope's been sitting there for 600 years, and you're sitting there with the Pope. I hardly even knew any bishops before we got this job. The two that buried Dad, Bishop Gander and Beltran here, And I knew Bishop Slattery here, and those are about the only bishops I'd ever met.
To make
So
small
it's pretty
talk with the
nerve-wracking.
Pope, it's hard to say, hi, how are you, like we say here, huh?
Exactly, so I couldn't talk at all. So he started speaking, and then I started speaking. I said a couple of things that are really important to the President of the First Amendment, and he said, the First Amendment has been a great experiment. It's worked out very well for the United States. We talked a little bit how it might be good for Europe to have had that at different times, separation of church and state. And I knew from having a brief that he was really clued in on the First Amendment, had actually made some talks about it at Notre Dame, in fact. So he knew the United States.
Francis Rooney, and I'm just thinking about, Margaret and I were in Rome, and we drove by the ambassador's house at the time. I know many, many Oklahomans were invited to visit him and stay with him while he was the ambassador to the Holy See. Let's jump to Rabbi Charles Sherman of Temple, Israel. He served the temple for nearly 40 years. And this is a great story about people coming out to help. There was a flood of 1984 that many of you will remember. And you know where Temple Israel is, right across from Utica Square. Well, as the waters came down, they flooded the entire sanctuary of Temple Israel. And including books, their prayer books and all, obviously were, well, not damaged completely, but they became wet and underwater. And so I wanted you to hear what Charles Sherman said. Who helped the Jews who attended that temple? And this is what he says.
In 1984, the congregation faced a huge challenge, and that was the Memorial Day weekend when the temple was flooded. Maybe you can briefly sum up what happened there and how the community came out to support. And I think it's a reflection on the congregation and on the community at large. Tell us what happened.
Well, first of all, we refer to this as the Malcolm Millstone Memorial Day flood. Malcolm was 3 weeks into his presidency, and we had this terrible flood. We had just built a Hebrew Learning Center in the basement, 2 rooms equipped so that between Kansas City and Dallas, this was the finest Reformed Conservative Orthodox Hebrew learning laboratory that existed. It was a state-of-the-art facility. We got too much water. There's a fence along the border between our next-door neighbors, Cassia Hall, and the temple. The water came down Yorktown. Maybe there were those who speculated because there used to be a lot more green that could absorb the water. Now there was concrete. Water had no place to go. Along the fence were shrubs, bushes. It made a dam until it could no longer hold. Then the fence burst, and all of that water poured onto the temple grounds and into the basement of the temple. Here in the sanctuary, there was water that was approximately 6 inches up on all of the wooden pews. The Hebrew Learning Center was destroyed. I never had witnessed such destructions when I walked down those steps as far as I could get into the basement. I didn't realize water could do that kind of damage. All of the pews, as they dried, these beautiful wooden pews, cracked, all of them. So the question was whether we had to replace all of this or not. The community response, people who lived in the neighborhood, descended upon the temple, some of them with mops and buckets and brooms. What can we do to help? These were not Jewish people. These were our neighbors. When the word got out that the temple had been injured this way, neighboring churches offered us their facilities very, very generously. What do you need? The picture that sticks in my mind, our prayer books had become soaked with water. And 2 different things happened. Women from the neighborhood and from the congregation brought, what do you call it? Hair dryers, thank you, to dry out the prayer books. And then there was a theory that if you had an ironing board, you could iron page by page I mean, we're talking about 350, 400-page prayer books, if you can imagine. People willing to put in that time to see if we can't save prayer books.
Isn't that amazing? And you know what I like to believe? That this church has that same spirit. That if we had been near them, around them, or whatever, that this church would have been one of the first to go down there and said, what can we do? And nice to belong to a church that has the spirit that we have here. Okay, ministers more and more today are called upon to speak about social issues. Either the congregation says, you have to speak on such an issue. I don't even want to say the names of them. And so ministers today are asked to speak more and more on social issues. This is a story of a man who was asked to speak on a social issue, and his name was Dr. James Buskirk. And he was pastor of First Methodist Church for many, many years. He and his wife Nancy, and then he founded the dean of the School of Theology at Oral Roberts University. They were serving a church in Mississippi, in Coldwater, Mississippi. Now, back in the 60s, where this setting takes place, racial discord in the 60s. You can about imagine what was going on, and particularly maybe Mississippi. And so there was a point where he felt he needed to speak about that in the pulpit. His life was threatened. He knew it was going to be threatened before he did it, but he knew he needed to speak. So here's Jim Buskirk, and Margaret and I attended First Methodist Church for many, many years, and we heard his ministry there. But here's Jim talking about that time period.
Where did the two of you serve then in Mississippi?
We served in Pittsburgh, and then later, after we finished seminary, we came back to Mississippi, and we were appointed to Coldwater, Mississippi, and we were there for 3 years. That was an unusual time. James Meredith entered Ole Miss, and Mississippi got in an uproar over this black man who had entered Ole Miss. And our church was upset about it as well. The men came to me and said, the church is growing, everything's going well, don't talk about that. But Nancy was teaching school there to help pay our school debts. A young Baptist boy who was going in the ministry said a very angry thing about Meredith, and we realized that their hatred was getting in the young people, and I announced that on a Sunday night I was going to preach on the high cost of hate. It was contagious, and I did. The church got upset. About 16 men met on the street and would come straighten me out. God had a sense of humor. He sent one of the wives by there, and she spoke to her husband, John, and told him she needed something in the store in front of which they were, and went in and said, I don't need anything. What's going on? He said, we're going to go straighten that preacher out. She said, well, if you killed him, you wouldn't change his mind. If you don't know that, you aren't listening tonight, and I know you'll do what you're led to do, but I'm praying that you'll follow me home. The man I married wouldn't have done this. So he went out and said, men, I can't go with you. They went to another place and talked, and an alcoholic with whom I was lifting weights and trying to win to Christ heard him there and quieted that discussion, came, told me their names. I went around and see them individually. And individually, as we talked, they recanted and came back to church the next Sunday.
Those men, do you think they were really intent on inflicting bodily harm on you?
Yes, I talked to them the next day, and they were each still angry.
Because your message, a little bit about it, that angered them.
I preached a Christian message, and I talked about couldn't love God and hate your neighbor. Okay. And I told them that there's a young man in town who was thinking about going into ministry who was filled with anger. He was not in our church, but Nancy knew him in the school where she was a librarian. I said, if it's happening to them, it's happening in your young people, and I feel like, under God, I have to speak to you about this in love. I'm your pastor, and I'm responsible. So I did, and as much as I was responsible, accordingly, they were angry. I think they would have come.
Were you fearing a backlash so that when you walked into the pulpit, you know, well, here goes, and I can expect anything, or did you not expect anything?
Well, I had a bit of a trembling spirit, but the Lord calmed that, and after the service over, Nancy and I just drove around in town at perfect peace. We didn't know anything about the mob till the next morning when the guy came and told us that we spoke to him at the second place they went. We stayed and didn't have to leave Mississippi like 26 of our best friends did with whom we were in seminary to go to other states. It was really a treacherous time.
That's Pastor Jim Buskirk. I recorded that December 19, 2013. He died 6 years later, and he was 87 years old. So I have two voices that are no longer alive, and that's Jim Buskirk and Oral Roberts. Much has been written, but it's so fun and interesting to hear their voices. It brings an extra dimension to it. We talk about HD on television. This is HD in oral history. I meant to say that when Luke was interviewing witnesses, I was going to say, and I think now, maybe he was doing Voices of Israel or Voices of... I'm glad you laughed. I got that out there. Right. Then there are ministers. Did we know that ministers are human? Did we know that they have problems, even among their spouses? I appreciate David Emery so much because he brings some of that to his sermons, that he's human, that he has problems, or problems with your children. Now, this is a case where, and years ago, they didn't talk about that at all. Maybe many ministers still don't. But Reverend Dr. Muzan Biggs of Boston Avenue Methodist Church, he shows how the ministers have problems, and he admits that there are those, the bishop would say, you shouldn't talk about your personal life. Well, he felt he needed to do that. Muzan and his wife Gail have two sons now, but before the sons arrived, they adopted a daughter whose name is Allison. And here's a minister trying to deal with this adopted daughter. And I just thought it was interesting to hear how that happened. And many of you may have issues with children yourself for the same reasons that Muzan Biggs will talk about.
When Gail and I had been married 6 years and had no children, we were having trouble getting pregnant. We were told that maybe adoption would be the best way to go. And we adopted. Our first child was a daughter named Allison. She was born at the Methodist Mission Home in San Antonio, Texas. Had a lot of problems. By the time she was 12, was slipping around at friends' houses and having a little alcohol. Later we found out a little marijuana. Later became cocaine. Later became crack cocaine. She died at 31. She was out in California, had been married and divorced twice, had no children. Out in the Oakland, California area one night, got a mix of alcohol and drugs that stopped her heart. She died shortly before her 32nd birthday. Our daughter was born in 1965. That was in the height of one of the drug epidemics in this country, the anti-Vietnam War protests and so on. The home in San Antonio was very secretive back in those days. They promised young pregnant women, if you will have your baby here and place it for adoption instead of abortion or something else, we will see to it that this child does not suddenly appear on your doorstep when he or she's 20 and you're remarried and have started your life over. They also said to adoptive parents, if you adopt through this agency, when you've come to love this child more than your own life, you will not have a mother or father reclaiming the child. So it was all very secretive. So we don't know the background that Allison had, but this professor thinks she could have had fetal alcohol syndrome or could have been drug addicted even before she was born. Not sure, but she never really bonded with anybody. There were a lot of problems. From the time she could talk, almost a habitual liar. Unlike any person I'd ever known in my life. I'd never known anybody like her in my life. Gail and I agonized over her for many, many years and never were able to help her make the turn. Again, she was given every opportunity that our two sons were later as they came along, but they responded wonderfully well and she did not.
So your life in the church, did she reject the church flat out from the beginning?
No. I mean, it was a rule at our house. In the same way you don't get to vote on going to public school, you don't get to vote on going to church either. When you're an adult, you can reject anything you like. So she was baptized as an infant and grew up in the Sunday school and church, was confirmed, sang in our choirs here at the church and all. It was another life out there beyond the church, yeah.
Must have made you, in your ministry, sympathetic to the families who were going through this, and in your counseling, it must have affected you.
We had a retired bishop here at that time, Bishop Paul Galloway, a wonderful man that had grown up in an era when preachers admitted no fault. Preachers didn't have problems, and if they did, they didn't talk about them. When Allison was 16, she went out the window of our upstairs park.
I'm sorry, I'm getting a phone call. And I can't stop it. This is the amazing iPhones that we have, and he's just getting ready to make a great point.
Down a tree and disappeared.
She went out the window and down a tree.
Counseling with her, had been for several years at that point. The counseling was helping Gil and me, but it wasn't helping Allison. It was helping us understand a little better as we went along what she was doing and why she was doing it, but she was not being turned at all. The counselor had told us, as you tighten more and more, she will either start to conform or she'll break and run. She broke and ran. We didn't know where she was and did not know for the next 2 years where she was. She had hitchhiked from here all the way to Colorado. It was a long, long story. It wasn't a boy thing for her. It was a drug thing. It was drugs, and we were not going to tolerate them in our house. Anyway, I talked with Bishop Galloway and poured out my heart, and I said, Bishop, I think this church needs to know what we're going through, because they might find her out there in a ditch somewhere tomorrow. We didn't know for sure that she wasn't still in Tulsa or close by. The counselor had told us, if your church people jump on you for not being out there looking for her, you send them to me and I will read them the story of the prodigal son. Sometimes fathers and mothers have to wait, and this is your time. You have to wait and see if she'll come home. And she didn't, ever. We saw her more than 2 years later, and we would go see her. With her permission, we would come and see her from time to time, but she never, ever lived at home again.
So you never know when your pastor is standing in front of you what kind of problems they have faced that past week. But I appreciated his openness to talk about his daughter, Allison. These interviews can be inspirational. Think of a young person who's listening to a speaker. Could be a religious speaker, could be a lawyer, could be a judge or whatever, and it sparks an interest to start a career because they listen to oral history. Think of a young man who probably listened. We have several inventors that I have interviewed, and listens to that, and it sparks an interest to create something that would be beneficial to mankind in our state, in our nation. So that's what these Voices of Oklahoma is all about. You need to collect the voices in your family, as I've already said. I have the voice of my father. Our daughter Michelle was 50 years old at the end of May when she died in India. And of course she was so young you didn't think about interviewing her, but I had recorded her introducing one of my voices. And so I have that. I know a man in town, they lost their son when he was 40 years old, and his wife listens to the young man's voice on the voicemail every night, just to hear the voice, because hearing the voice can keep you close. So, record your family stories. You'll be very, very glad you did. And I'm very glad that I was here today, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you.